I've brought your towels back, Roger. I expect the property line to be respected from now on.
Admiral Roland Kessler had already turned back to his circle of laughing officers. Dara Whitfield did not move. She held her small clutch a little tighter, and a folded corner of paper slid partway out of it. Worn, official-looking, a faded government stamp barely visible along the crease. Somewhere behind him, his wife, Vivian Kessler, laughed into her champagne glass, telling him to be kind because the poor thing was lost. A young officer near the bar, glancing at the paper edge peeking from Dara's hand, frowned faintly, then looked away and said nothing. Nobody asked what the paper was. Dara tucked it back inside her clutch, unhurried, the way a person handles something they've learned never to explain twice. The Admiral clinked his glass against another officer's, remarking that somebody should find her a coat check because she was confusing the room. Laughter rolled through the ballroom again, easy, careless, the kind that costs the people laughing nothing at all. Dara looked past him, toward the far end of the hall, where a young lieutenant commander stood with his back turned. He was unaware that the woman he'd spent 15 years trying to find was standing 40 feet behind him, holding an invitation no one in that room had bothered to read. The town of Millbrook Falls had never asked Dara Whitfield very much about herself, and she had never offered. She ran a small tailoring shop on the corner of 5th and Pine, wedged between a hardware store and a laundromat that never quite stopped smelling of bleach. The sign above the door read, "Whitfield's Alterations," in hand-painted letters she had touched up herself every spring. Inside, the shop smelled of chalk and steam, and the particular sharpness of good thread. Bolts of fabric stood in neat columns along the back wall, organized not by color but by weight, the way she had once organized ammunition. She had lived in Millbrook Falls for 11 years. In that time, she had hemmed wedding dresses, mended church robes, and let out the waistbands of 100 men's suits, without once making any of them feel small for asking. She kept the shop's hours posted in the window, and she kept them exactly, the way some people keep promises. Most days, nobody looked at her twice. That was, she had come to understand, its own kind of mercy. On a Tuesday morning in March, Mrs. Adler came in with her husband's funeral suit, the one he had bought 30 pounds ago and never worn since. Mrs. Adler set it on the counter and did not look at Dara while she spoke. "Can you make it fit by Thursday? I know that's fast for someone like you." Dara did not ask what someone like you meant. She had stopped asking a long time ago, back when the answer used to matter to her. She only nodded, took the suit, and said, "Thursday's fine." She had it finished by Wednesday afternoon. That was the rhythm of her life now, doing more than was asked, saying less than she could, and letting the quiet do the work that arguing never had. She had learned that lesson on a mountain, though nobody in Millbrook Falls knew that, and she intended to keep it that way. At the edge of her workbench, tucked beneath a pincushion shaped like a strawberry, sat a small wooden box. She did not open it during business hours. She opened it in the evenings, after she had flipped the sign to closed and pulled the blinds halfway in the particular gray light that came right before she turned on the lamps. Inside the box was a single folded letter, the paper gone soft at the creases from years of handling. It was addressed to her in handwriting she could have picked out of 1,000 others. Corporal Sam Ruiz had written it 3 days before the mission that ended his life, meaning to mail it home to his mother, and had given it to Dara instead, laughing, telling her to hang on to it so she'd have something to tease him about when they both made it back stateside. She had made it back. He had not. She read the letter perhaps twice a year now, not because she'd forgotten the words, but because some things are meant to be visited rather than memorized. Tonight was not one of those nights. Tonight she only touched the corner of the box, the way another person might touch a doorframe on their way out of a room, a small ritual that asked nothing and meant everything. The knock at the shop's back door came later than she expected, close to 8, when the street outside had gone quiet except for the hum of the laundromat sign. It was the mail carrier, Pete, apologizing for the hour, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope that had been misdelivered 2 streets over. "Government seal on this one," Pete said, turning it over in his hands before passing it to her. "Didn't want to leave it in your box overnight, case it's important." Dara turned the envelope over once she was alone. She recognized the seal before she read a single word beneath it, and something in her chest went very still, the way stillness used to come to her on a ridge before a shot. Not fear exactly, but a kind of readiness for a thing she had spent years trying not to need. She did not open it right away. She set it on the counter beside the wooden box, and she stood there for a long moment in the half-dark, one hand resting on the strawberry pincushion, and let herself remember, just for a moment, what it had felt like to matter to someone in a way the whole world was allowed to see. When she finally broke the seal, she read the letter through twice. It said, in the careful, formal language of people who write letters for institutions rather than for people, that after 15 years, a mission once buried under classification had finally been unsealed. It said that a ceremony was being held. It said that men she had once kept alive through a night neither of them was supposed to survive would be present, and that their names, and the name of the man who had died beside her, would be spoken aloud, publicly, for the first time. She sat down on the stool behind the register, the same stool where she fitted hems and pinned sleeves, and pressed her palm flat against the letter the way she had once pressed her palm flat against cold rock. She did not know yet who else would be standing in that ballroom. She only knew that after 11 years of being nobody in particular, she was finally going to hear Sam Ruiz's name spoken by someone other than herself. She began looking for a dress the very next morning. "Confirm your position, Saint. We need a status report before this goes any further." The voice crackled through the radio, thin and urgent, half swallowed by static and wind. Dara Whitfield lay flat against the rock, her cheek pressed to the stock of her rifle, and did not answer right away. Beside her, Corporal Sam Ruiz adjusted the spotting scope a fraction of an inch and exhaled slow through his teeth. "They want a timeline," Sam said. "Command always wants a timeline right when there isn't one to give." Below them, a mile and a half down a valley the maps did not bother to name, 9 men were pinned in a dry riverbed as the light failed around them. Dara could see them only as shapes now, dark commas against the pale wash of stone, and she understood without needing anyone to explain it to her that the storm rolling in from the ridge behind her was going to take the sky away from all of them within the hour. The rock beneath her had gone cold hours ago, the particular cold that worked its way up through a person's ribs and stayed there, and she had learned long before this mission not to fight it, only to breathe around it the way she breathed around everything that could not be changed by wanting it to be different. She keyed the radio once. "Position confirmed. Eyes on target. Standing by." It was not enough for the voice on the other end. It rarely was. "Copy, but I need more than eyes on target," the voice said. "I need a full verification before I authorize anything from up there. Command wants to see the whole picture before they sign off on engagement." Sam glanced sideways at her, jaw tight. "There isn't time for a whole picture," he muttered, not into the radio, just to her, the way he said most of the things that actually mattered. Dara didn't answer him either. She was already reading the valley the way she read every valley. The wind first, then the light, then the small telling details nobody had trained her to notice, and that she noticed anyway. The way a plant leans, the way dust moves, the way silence sits differently right before it breaks. Somewhere far below, a man shifted his weight against a rock that wasn't going to hold him much longer, and she filed that away without deciding to, the same way she filed away everything that might matter in the next 10 minutes. The radio crackled again. "Saint, be advised, until we get full verification and a clean report on the ground situation, this stays a hold position. No shots authorized. Do you copy?" "Copy," she said. Her voice did not change at all. Sam lowered the scope for a second and looked at her, and something passed between them that had no need of words. The particular language of two people who have learned to trust each other more than they trust anyone giving orders from somewhere warm and dry and far away. "They don't know what's happening down there," Sam said quietly. "They're asking for paperwork in the middle of a firefight." "They're asking because it's their job to ask," Dara said. "Doesn't mean they're wrong to. Doesn't mean they're right either." She didn't argue with that. She had long since stopped needing to be right in the moment. She only needed to be ready when the moment came apart, because moments like this one always did, eventually, whether or not anyone above her had finished verifying it. She thought briefly of every report she had ever filed after the fact, every form asking her to describe in writing something that had happened in less time than it took to read the question, and how none of those forms had ever once arrived early enough to save anyone. Below, in the riverbed, the shapes moved. One of them dropped low behind a rock that would not hold against what was coming. Another gestured frantic toward the ridge, toward her, toward help that could not yet be authorized to arrive. She watched a third man press himself flat against the stone and go still in the particular way of someone trying to disappear, and she recognized that stillness because she had worn it herself, once, a long time ago, in circumstances that had nothing to do with mountains. The wind shifted, carrying the first cold breath of the storm across her cheek. Sam's voice dropped even lower, the calm murmur he used only when things were about to become very simple and very hard at the same time. "Wind's picking up," he said. "You're going to lose the shot window in about 4 minutes if this storm rolls in the way I think it will." "I know. They still haven't cleared us." "I know that too." She did not reach for the radio again. She understood, the way she understood wind and light and the small lies distance tells a person's eyes, that the report command wanted, the clean, verified picture, the full timeline, was never going to arrive in time to matter. Down in the riverbed, 9 men did not have the luxury of waiting for someone else's paperwork to catch up to the truth of what was happening to them. She had learned, somewhere in the years before this mountain, that the people asking for verification were rarely the people who would pay for the wait, and that the weight of that arithmetic always landed in the end on whoever was closest to the danger. Sam shifted beside her, steadying the scope again, his breathing slow, deliberate, the same rhythm he used before every call he had ever made for her. "Half value," he said. "Hold. Not yet." She settled deeper into the stone, the cold already working its way into her hands, and watched the first shapes begin to move against them from the far side of the wash, dark figures spreading out along the rocks the way water finds the low ground. There were more of them now than there had been 10 minutes ago, and she understood, watching them gather, that whatever verification command wanted was going to arrive far too late to change the shape of what was coming. The storm broke a moment later, swallowing the last of the light, and somewhere behind her, faint and useless now, the radio kept asking for a report nobody down in that valley had time left to give. The storm did not pass in minutes the way storms are supposed to. It settled over the ridge and stayed, and for the next 11 hours, Dara Whitfield became something the wind and the dark could not account for. She did not think of it as fighting. She thought of it later only as holding a door shut with her whole body while something on the other side kept testing the hinges. Every time a shape rose from the rocks below to rush the riverbed, she answered it, and every time she answered it, one fewer shape rose the next time. Sam Ruiz stayed beside her the entire night, calling the wind in a low, steady murmur that never once cracked, even as his hands went numb and his voice went hoarse from the cold. "Hold half a value," he said somewhere past hour 6, when her own hands had gone past cold into something closer to nothing at all. "Now full. Now hold." She held. Somewhere around hour 4, she had stopped being able to feel her own trigger finger as anything more than an idea, a thing she trusted to move correctly because it always had, and she flexed it between shots, one knuckle at a time, the way a person checks a lock they have already checked twice. Sam noticed. Sam noticed everything about her that night, the way a spotter learns to notice the person he is keeping alive, and every so often, without being asked, he would reach over and press his gloved hand briefly against her wrist, just to be sure the cold hadn't taken more from her than either of them could afford to lose. Near midnight, a heavy weapon crew worked its way along the far lip of the wash, close enough that the next volley would have ended everything below in a single pass. There was no time to think about range or wind or the dark pressing down over both. Sam's hand landed flat against her back, steady, grounding. "Quiet as anything," he said. "You're still here. Keep breathing." She kept breathing. The gun crew never fired. There was a stretch after that, 20 minutes or perhaps longer, when nothing moved at all, and the two of them lay in that terrible stillness, listening to the storm work itself into something worse. And Sam had talked, low and constant, about nothing in particular. A diner back home that made biscuits the size of a man's fist. A dog he'd had as a kid that used to steal his shoes. The sound his mother's screen door made when it swung shut behind her. Dara had not answered much of it. She hadn't needed to. She understood, even then, that he was not talking to fill the silence for himself. He was talking to keep her tethered to something warm, while the rest of the night tried to take that from her 1 hour at a time. It was near the end of the night, when the storm had begun to thin at last and dawn was still an hour off, that Sam saw the movement behind them half a second before she did. Men had worked their way up the back of the ridge in the cover of the weather, hunting whoever had been keeping the valley closed all night. Sam did not call out a warning. There was no time for one. He put himself between the danger and her, and in the half-second that bought her to turn, he was the one who paid for it. The sound he made was small, almost nothing, swallowed by the wind before it could become anything larger, and by the time she had turned back to him, whatever had needed ending was already ended. When the shooting stopped and she reached for him in the dark, his hand was still closed around the spotting scope and he did not answer her. She said his name twice, quiet, the way you say a name when some part of you already understands there will be no answer, and then she did not say it again. She did not have time to fall apart. There were still men breathing in that riverbed, and the night was not finished with any of them yet. She took his dog tag and put it around her own neck, the metal still warm from his skin, and she went back to the gun alone, and she finished what the two of them had started together, calling her own wind now, in a voice she barely recognized as hers. When the sky finally lightened and the aircraft could reach the wash, she came down off the ridge on foot to help pull out the last of the wounded, because the extraction bird could not land close enough, and because she had never once in her life left a job half-finished. Her legs did not want to hold her at first, 11 hours of stillness having settled into her joints like something poured and left to set, but she made them move anyway, the way she had made every part of herself move that entire night, because there was still work left, and the work did not care how tired she was. The youngest of them lay in the gray light with a wound in his leg, barely conscious, and she knelt over him and worked the bleeding closed with hands that had not stopped being steady even after 11 hours of holding a door shut with her whole body. He looked up at her, too far gone to hold much of anything in focus, his lips moving around words that never quite became sound, and what he saw, before the aircraft crew pulled him onto the bird, was a woman's face he would spend the next 15 years trying to describe to people who never quite believed him. Then she was gone, back up into the rocks, to bring home the only person who had ever really seen her. The gala, 15 years later, moved around Admiral Roland Kessler the way Rooms had learned to move around him for most of his career. Easily, admiringly, a little afraid. He told the story of the ridge often. He had told it at dinners, at promotion boards, at the kind of gatherings where a man's reputation is built one polished sentence at a time. He told it beautifully, the way a man tells a story he has smoothed the rough edges off of over many retellings, about a unit pinned in a riverbed on the far side of the world, about a storm that should have ended 9 lives, and about an unseen shooter on a mountain who had somehow, impossibly, kept them all alive until morning. He told it because his own son had been one of those 9 men. He never told the part he did not actually know, which was nearly all of it. He had never learned the shooter's name. The mission had been sealed so completely that even a man with his rank had only ever been given a single word to hold on to, a call sign the survivors said like something between a rank and a prayer. "To Saint," he would say at the end of it, lifting his glass, and the table would go quiet in exactly the reverent way he had learned to expect, and he would let that quiet sit there and warm him for a moment before moving on to the next story. He liked the story best for what it did to a room, the way grown officers went soft and thoughtful for a moment before remembering who was telling it, and he had never once, in 15 years, considered that the warmth belonged to someone else entirely. It had never once occurred to him, in 15 years of telling it, to wonder where she might actually be standing. Tonight, across the ballroom, his son, Lieutenant Commander Eli Kessler, stood near the bar half listening to his father hold court the way he had learned to half listen years ago. The story worn smooth from repetition, comfortable in its familiar shape. He had heard it so many times he could have told it himself, could have supplied the pauses and the lifted glass and the reverent hush without missing a beat. And some tired, private part of him had stopped hearing the actual words a long time ago. He had no reason yet to look twice at the woman near the far wall in the plain gray dress, standing very still while his father's circle of officers laughed at something she had apparently said. He would, in a few minutes, but not yet. The laughter that reached Eli Kessler's ear was his father's laugh, the easy, confident one that meant Admiral Roland Kessler had found something in the room to amuse himself with. Eli had heard that particular laugh at 100 parties. He did not turn around right away. "Use the service door, honey, before someone important sees you standing here," his father was saying, somewhere behind him to someone Eli hadn't yet bothered to look at. A woman's voice answered, even and unhurried. "I was invited." Vivian Kessler's laugh followed, bright and careless. "Franklin, be kind. The poor thing's lost." Eli turned then, mostly out of habit, the way you turn toward any small commotion at a party where you already know how the evening is going to go. What he saw was a woman in a plain gray dress, standing very still near the edge of the circle his father had gathered around himself, holding a small clutch in both hands, saying nothing further. "Catering doesn't wear gray like that," his father said, grinning at the officers around him, delighted with himself. "Somebody get her a coat check." The circle laughed again. It was, Eli thought, without much interest, the kind of joke his father had been making his whole career, at the expense of whoever happened to be standing nearest and looked, for whatever reason, like they didn't belong. He had watched his father do this at enough parties that it barely registered anymore, a habit as unremarkable to him as clearing his throat before a toast. Vivian stepped closer, swirling her champagne. "What's your name, dear? We'll have someone show you where you're supposed to be." "Dara," the woman said. Just that. No last name offered, no explanation given. "Dara," Vivian repeated, testing the word like it amused her. "And what exactly are you meant to be doing here tonight, Dara?" "I was invited," Dara said again, in precisely the same tone as the first time, as though repetition were simply a fact stated twice rather than an argument she was losing. Roland Kessler's smile widened at that, the particular widening of a man who has found a new angle to play with. "Invited," he said. "By whom exactly? The catering company doesn't usually send its staff a formal invitation." "I have one," Dara said. She did not raise the clutch. She did not open it. She only said it, plainly, the way a person states something true and expects it to be taken as such. "I'm sure you do," Roland said, and the way he said it made clear he had no intention of asking to see it. A woman near the edge of the circle, someone's wife, someone whose name nobody would remember later, laughed softly into her glass, and the laugh gave the other officers permission to laugh again too, the way permission works in rooms like that one, quietly, without anyone ever quite deciding to grant it. Near the bar, Petty Officer Cole Tran had stopped talking to the two men beside him and was watching now with the particular stillness of someone who has noticed something is wrong and has not yet decided what, if anything, he is allowed to do about it. He had seen the folded paper in her clutch earlier, just the corner of it, stamped with a seal he didn't recognize but understood somehow to be official. Nobody else seemed to have noticed it at all. "Somebody should check that," Cole said quietly, mostly to himself, and the officer beside him gave him a look that suggested he mind his own evening. "You worried about the catering staff's paperwork, Tran?" the officer beside him said, not unkindly, more amused than anything, and Cole let it go, the way a young man lets things go when the room has already decided which direction the evening is moving in, and he has not yet worked out how to turn it. Roland Kessler was not finished. He rarely was once a room had started laughing with him. He lifted his glass higher, and something in his posture shifted into performance, a man addressing an audience rather than a person. "A toast!" he announced, loud enough to draw a few more eyes toward the small scene at the edge of the ballroom. "To the help, wherever she's actually supposed to be standing tonight." A ripple of laughter went through the nearby crowd, uncertain in places, eager in others. Somewhere in the middle distance, a phone rose to catch it, and then a second one, the small blue light of a recording indicator blinking in the low chandelier glow. Dara did not flinch. She stood the way she had stood on a ridge 15 years before a storm. Weight settled, breath even, the particular stillness of someone who has already decided that this moment, whatever it cost her, was not the one worth spending her voice on. She had learned a long time ago that a room like this one would eventually run out of things to say if nobody gave it anything new to work with. And she had decided, somewhere in the first 30 seconds of this conversation, that she was not going to be the one to feed it. "You should be careful who you decide isn't worth your time," she said, quiet enough that only the people closest to her caught it clearly. Vivian laughed outright at that, delighted. "Oh, she's got some spirit after all." Roland leaned in then, grinning, milking the moment for whatever it was worth to the small crowd now watching. "Go on then," he said. "Enlighten us. What exactly are you, if not catering?" It was in that lean, that small closing of distance meant only for effect, that his hand brushed briefly against her wrist, and the loose cuff of her sleeve slid back an inch further than either of them intended. Along the pale skin above her wrist, thin and old and unmistakable once seen, sat the raised line of a scar that ran up toward her collarbone, the kind a body only earns from something that very nearly finished it. Nobody in the immediate circle understood yet what they were looking at. Roland glanced at it for half a second and dismissed it entirely, already turning back to his audience for the next line he was preparing. Some men's minds so full of the sound of their own voice that there is no room left in them to notice anything that might interrupt it. But across the ballroom, Eli Kessler, who had spent 15 years describing that exact scar to doctors, to therapists, to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen to him try to explain the woman who had saved his life on a mountain he was never allowed to name, went suddenly and completely still, his glass forgotten halfway to his mouth, the noise of the ballroom around him falling away into something distant and unimportant. Eli Kessler crossed the ballroom without any clear memory of deciding to move. People stepped aside for him the way people step aside from something moving with purpose, though he could not have said in that moment what his purpose was beyond reaching her before the distance between them closed into something he couldn't undo. His heart was doing something strange and enormous in his chest, some old animal part of him recognizing, before the rest of him had caught up, exactly what he was walking toward. He stopped in front of Dara Whitfield, close enough now to see the scar clearly, the same raised line he had traced with his own finger 100 times in his mind, trying to describe it to people who nodded politely and never quite believed him. His eyes moved from her wrist to her face and back again, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out cracked and much younger than he meant it to sound. "It's you," he said. "My God, it's actually you!" Dara went very still. She had learned that boy's face 15 years ago in the gray light of dawn, half-conscious, bleeding, too far gone to hold her features in focus. She had spent 15 years not knowing whether he had lived long enough to reach the aircraft, had carried that particular unanswered question quietly through 11 years of hemming dresses and mending suits, and here, at last, without warning, stood its answer. "You made it home," she said. It was not a question. It was 15 years of a wound she had never let herself name, closing over at last. Roland Kessler's smile had not yet caught up to what was happening in front of him. "Eli," he said, half laughing still, "do you know this woman?" Eli did not look at his father. His hand was already moving toward the inside pocket of his jacket, and when it came out, it was holding a small brass coin, its edges worn smooth from years of being turned over by a thumb that had never quite stopped needing something to hold on to. "We had these made," Eli said, his voice breaking further with every word. "All 9 of us. We never knew your name. We never knew your face. We only knew you were real, and we swore we'd never stop looking." He pressed the coin into her hand and closed her fingers around it, the way a person closes something precious before they can talk themselves out of letting it go. "I have a wife. I have a daughter. They exist because of you. Every single thing I have exists because of you." The ballroom had begun, in the way rooms do, to notice that something larger than a joke was unfolding at its edges. Conversations faltered. Phones that had been raised for mockery a few minutes earlier stayed raised now for an entirely different reason. Somewhere near the back, a woman set down her drink without seeming to notice she'd done it, and the small clink of the glass against the table carried further than it should have in the sudden hush. At the front of the hall, near the small stage where the evening's formal program had not yet begun, General Marcus Voss set down his own glass and studied the scene with the particular stillness of a man who has recognized something before anyone around him has caught up to it. He had known from the moment Dara Whitfield walked into the room exactly who she was. He had watched the last 10 minutes unfold from across the room with an expression that had slowly, deliberately closed like a door. And he had waited, the way careful men wait, for the exact moment when stepping in would matter more than stepping in early. He stepped to the microphone and tapped it once. The sound cut cleanly through the murmur. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and though his voice was not loud, it filled every corner of the hall the way only certain voices can. "We are here tonight to finally do, in public, something that should have been done 15 years ago." He looked directly at Dara. "Tonight, this room honors a woman whose actions were sealed under classification for 15 years. She held a position alone, through a storm, for 11 hours, and brought 9 men home who otherwise would not have survived the night." He paused, letting the words settle fully before continuing. "For 15 years, the men she saved knew her only by a single word. Tonight, we can finally say her name in the light. Dara Whitfield. Some of you have heard her called something else." The sound that moved through the ballroom was not applause. It was something older and lower than applause, 300 people drawing the same breath at once, and then, one by one, beginning to rise to their feet. An older officer near the back, a man who had spent 30 years learning not to be impressed by very much, wiped at his eyes with the back of one hand and did not seem to care who saw him do it. General Voss continued reading, the formal language of citation and record, the range, the wind, the 11 hours, numbers that made seasoned officers shake their heads slowly because they understood, in a way no civilian in the room could, exactly how far outside the ordinary those numbers sat. Somewhere in the crowd, a young officer who had laughed loudest at the Admiral's toast a few minutes earlier now stood with his hand pressed flat over his mouth, staring at the woman he had been amused by only moments before, as though seeing her for the first time. When Voss reached the line about a spotter who had given his life shielding the shooter so she could continue holding the position, Dara closed her eyes, and for the first time all evening, allowed 2 tears to fall. Sam Ruiz's name, spoken aloud, in a room full of the living. It was, she would think later, the only part of the entire evening she had actually come for. General Voss let his gaze move, once, deliberately, to Admiral Roland Kessler. "For those who may not be familiar with the tradition," he said, "there is one distinction in this country that reverses the ordinary order of things. Whoever is decorated for actions of this nature receives the first salute from every person present, regardless of rank, up to and including the most senior officer in the room. Nothing outranks it. Nothing." Roland Kessler stood frozen at the center of a circle that, moments earlier, had been laughing at his jokes. Now every face in that circle had turned toward him instead, and the weight of all of it landed on him at once. The mockery, the toast, the hand he'd raised only to point out her sleeve. He understood, in the particular slow way that men who have spent their whole lives being admired understand humiliation, that whatever happened in the next few seconds was going to follow him into every room he ever walked into again. Eli was the first to move. He stepped back from Dara, drew himself to full attention, and raised his hand in the slowest, most deliberate salute of his career, tears running freely down his face and off his jaw, unashamed of anyone watching him do it. Then, one after another, the room followed. Officers who had laughed along with Roland minutes earlier came to attention now, hands raised, faces changed. Cole Tran, still near the bar, set down his glass and stood as straight as he had ever stood in his life, and for a brief moment his eyes met Dara's, and something passed between them that was not quite an apology, and not quite gratitude, but close to both. In the middle of all that motion, Dara stood exactly as still as she had stood through the whole evening, the brass coin pressed hard enough into her palm to leave a mark she would find later and not remember making. She was not thinking about Roland Kessler. She was thinking about a young man from a valley she had never learned the name of, a mother in Ohio she had never met, and a debt she had spent 15 years carrying alone that had, in this single moment, finally been shared. Roland Kessler's hand did not move. Every person in that ballroom understood, with a clarity that needed no further explanation, exactly what his stillness meant, and exactly what it would cost him. Roland Kessler's hand finally moved, though not by choice so much as by the absence of any other option left to him. He raised it, slow and trembling, to his brow, and held the salute the way a man holds something too heavy for him, his eyes wet with something that was not sorrow so much as the particular terror of watching his own reflection crack in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress. "Ma'am," he said, and the word came out strangled, nothing like the ease he'd used on her minutes before. "I had no idea who you were. We were only having a bit of—" He stopped himself, hearing the shape the sentence was forming, understanding there was no way to finish it that wasn't a confession. "If I had known who you were, I would have treated you like a human being." Dara let the silence sit there a moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice was quiet enough that the whole room had to lean in to catch it. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said. "That's the whole point, Admiral. You should have been kind to catering." It was not a taunt. It landed in the room the way a verdict lands, plain and final, and somewhere near the back someone said "Amen" under their breath and didn't bother to hide it. Beside him, Vivian Kessler had already begun the process of leaving her husband, though she had not yet taken a single step. She unhooked her hand from his arm slowly, deliberately, and opened a small gap of cold air between them that every phone in the room caught without meaning to. She was not thinking about Dara, or the Ridge, or the 11 hours. She was thinking about the cameras, and the confirmation hearing that would not survive this footage, and whether she would still be welcome at the good tables next season. It was a small, ugly thought to have in a room like that one, and some distant part of her recognized it as such, and she let it pass through her anyway, because old habits do not release a person simply because the moment finally deserves better of them. Roland noticed. Of course he noticed. It was the loneliest step anyone took in that ballroom all night, and it was taken by the person who had been standing closest to him. By morning, the clip had already found its way past the walls of that hall and into every feed in the country. An admiral mocking a decorated servicewoman he mistook for staff, then being forced to salute her while his own son wept openly at her side. There was a review. There was a statement full of careful language and the word regret. His name was quietly withdrawn from the promotion that everyone, including him, had assumed was already settled. It was not prison, and it was not ruin exactly, but it was the particular kind of ending reserved for men who are only ever punished by the loss of the rooms that used to admire them. A slow erosion of invitations and glances, and the easy deference he had spent a lifetime assuming was simply owed to him. Dara did not stay to watch any of it unfold. That had never been what she came for. What she did the following week was drive 4 hours to a small house where a gray-haired woman still kept a bedroom exactly the way her son had left it 15 years before. The bed made with the same corners, a jacket still hanging on the back of the door as though he might walk in and reach for it. Dara sat at that woman's kitchen table for the better part of an afternoon and told her in detail for the first time exactly what Sam Ruiz had done on that ridge. How he had read the wind like scripture, how his hand had landed flat on her back in the worst hour of the night and told her to keep breathing. How he had talked for 20 minutes straight about biscuits and a dog that stole shoes just to keep her tethered to something warm. How he had put his own body between the danger and hers without a single heartbeat of hesitation, and had died the way he had lived, watching over someone else until the very last second he had left to give. The woman cried without sound for a long while, and then, when she could speak again, she asked Dara to tell her the biscuit story one more time. And Dara did, slower this time, so that the woman could hold on to every part of it. Then Dara took the brass coin Eli had pressed into her palm, the one 9 men had carried between them for 15 years, and set it gently into his mother's hands. "This belongs with the person who made him who he was," she said. She started something with his name on it not long after. The Ruiz Fund, small at first, built quietly out of what she could spare from a tailoring shop that had never once made her rich. It paid a spotter's medical debt the country had never bothered to count. It covered a semester of college tuition for the daughter of a fallen reconnaissance Marine. It kept the lights on, for a season, in a small house belonging to a widow nobody in the government had remembered to call. None of it made the news, and Dara preferred it that way entirely. The whole point, she told Eli once when he offered to help her run it, was to be the thing that shows up quietly in the dark for someone else, the way she herself had once been saved by exactly that kind of quiet. He runs it with her now. He still calls her ma'am. She still tells him to stop. He never will. In the months that followed, Dara began receiving letters, not from generals or reporters, but from people the world had spent years walking past without a second look. A hospital orderly nobody had ever thanked properly. A rideshare driver who'd been asked more than once to prove he actually owned his own car. A quiet teenager in a town much like her own, who had been told for so long that he was nobody in particular that he had very nearly started to believe it. An elderly woman who cleaned offices at night and had never once in 30 years been asked her name by anyone she worked for. They all said some version of the same thing. "I saw what you told that admiral. I stood a little straighter today." She answered every one of them by hand, because she had been each of them once, long before any ballroom ever learned her name, and because a line held quietly in the dark is only ever worth as much as the people who are standing safely behind it. So here is the only question worth asking, now that you've heard the whole of it. If you had been standing in that ballroom, phone already halfway to your pocket, would you have laughed along with the room? Or would you have been the one person who asked to see what was actually in her hand?